Hola clase! Today we're going to read Carlos in the Cornfield by Jan Romero Stevens, illustrated by Jean Arnold. Carlos and the Cornfield. Carlos bent down to look through the sides of the glass case, then stood on his tippy toes to peer in from the top. Lying on a piece of dark blue velvet was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. A red pocket knife with 2 blades, a tiny pair of tweezers, scissors, a can opener, and a plastic toothpick. ¡Qué hermosa! How beautiful, he said, admiring the knife from all angles. Carlos took all the change from his pocket and counted it slowly, hoping he had enough money to buy the red pocket knife, but he was still several dollars short. Disappointed, he left Señor Lopez's store, hopped on his bicycle, and pedaled quickly down the street. After a few curves, the road turned to dirt and the houses came farther and farther apart. Carlos and his family lived in the fertile Española Valley in northern New Mexico. Their home, with its thick adobe walls and high-pitched tin roof, was next to a large field that Carlos's father planted each spring in rows of sweet yellow corn. How Carlos loved corn! He loved hot corn tortillas, spicy corn tamales at Christmas time, and corn on the cob, shiny with butter and sprinkled with salt. On cool fall mornings, he loved hot cornmeal pancakes drizzled with honey. Carlos changed out of his school clothes and walked out to the field to help his father. He began working the dark soil, breaking up the large clumps of dirt so that it was smooth and even. After about an hour, his father called to him, "Mijo, my son, I have a big job for you. Now that the ground is ready, I want you to plant the seeds. Come here and I'll show you what I need you to do." Carlos's father picked up a large bucket of corn seeds, which looked like dry kernels of corn. "The seeds must be planted in a very special way," Papa said, and he handed Carlos the bucket. "You must walk down the first row and drop 3 seeds, no more, into each hole. Otherwise, the corn will not grow right. When you finish the first row, start the second, and continue until the pail is empty. Remember, cosechas lo que siembras. You reap what you sow. Do you understand?" "Sí, Papa, I do," said Carlos, but he didn't really understand what Papa meant, and when he looked into the bucket, he thought he had never seen so much corn seed in his life. "Because this is such a big job, when you are finished, I will give you $5, said his Papa. Carlos could hardly believe his good fortune. With those $5, he would have enough money to buy that red pocket knife in Señor Lopez's store. Carlos was almost too excited to sleep that night, and right after breakfast, he ran outside to begin his job. 1, 2, 3. Carlos counted out 3 seeds and dropped them into the first hole. When he was finished with the long row, he turned around and looked back at where he started. It seemed so far away. But when he looked at his bucket of corn seeds, it looked just as full as it had when he had started. "Dios mío! My goodness," he thought. "I've planted all these seeds, but it doesn't seem like I've used any yet. I'll have to work even harder." So he moved to the next row and started again. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. He said to himself, counting the seeds, and finally he finished the second row. Again he looked into his bucket. Still, there seemed to be almost no difference in the number of seeds. Carlos was already starting to get tired and hot. He thought he would never finish his job. Just then, he had an idea. If he put 4 or 5 seeds in each hole instead of 3, he could finish much sooner. He began to count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 seeds in each hole this time. At the end of the 6th row, he looked into his bucket again. The pail still seemed almost as full as before. He was going to have to do something different to finish in time. Why not put 6 seeds in each hole? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. He said out loud as he dropped 6 kernels into the ground. But even then he didn't finish the job. So Carlos scooped out a handful of seeds for each hole and quickly emptied the bucket, leaving the last 2 rows unplanted. Excitedly, he ran up to the house where his father was having a drink of water. "Papa, Papa, I am finished," said Carlos, and he hurried to his room to get his money hidden in his dresser drawer underneath his t-shirts. When Carlos returned to the kitchen, his father handed him a $5 bill. "This is for you, mijo. You deserve it for working so hard." "Thank you, Papa," said Carlos, and he ran outside, grabbed his bicycle, and was off to Senor Lopez's store. "You're just in time," said Senor Lopez. He knew exactly what Carlos wanted as soon as he saw him. The old man folded up the tweezers, scissors, and blades on the red knife and carefully slipped it into a black felt pouch. Carlos paid Senor Lopez and rode quickly home. Every few minutes he checked to make sure the knife was still secure in his pocket. A few weeks passed and the days grew warmer. Carlos used his pocket knife often. He whittled a long pole for fishing and cut the fishing line with the knife's tiny scissors. Sometimes he needed the tweezers to remove a splinter from his finger. Once, he even used the can opener and ate lunch outside with his cousins. Carlos had forgotten about the cornfield. Then, one evening at dinner, his father told him the corn had begun to sprout. Carlos had an uneasy feeling. That night, he slipped out of his bedroom window into the moonlight. Carlos could see his father was right. The little plants had certainly sprouted. In the first rows of the field, the stalks grew straight and even. But in the middle rows, the plants had gone up in haphazard bunches. In the last rows, where he had run out of seeds, no plants were growing at all. Desperately, Carlos began pulling some of the tiny sprouts, transplanting them into the empty rows on the field. After working for nearly an hour, he could see it was no use. Tired and discouraged, he crawled back into his bedroom window. He slept late the next morning. When Mama came in to tell him that she and Papa were going to visit their aunt and uncle, Carlos told her he wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay home. As soon as his parents drove away, Carlos jumped on his bicycle and headed to Senor Lopez's store. Bursting through the door, out of breath, Carlos told Senor Lopez he wanted to sell his knife. "But Carlos," said Senor Lopez, "your knife is used. I can't sell it again." "Oh, please, Senor Lopez, I must have the money back," pleaded Carlos. Senor Lopez scratched his chin. He sensed there was a problem. "All right, Carlos," he said, opening his cash register and handing Carlos the money. Hopping back on his bike, Carlos headed to the feed store, where he purchased a bag of corn seeds. That night, he crawled out his window again, this time to plant the last row of the fields. In the moonlight, he poked new holes with a stick, then walked down the rows, carefully counting out exactly 3 seeds in each hole. Finally finishing his job, he went back to bed, sleeping soundly until the next morning. That year, Carlos's father harvested the field later than usual. He noticed something peculiar about the corn from the last 2 rows, but said nothing. One fall morning, Mama made cornmeal pancakes for breakfast. "Blue corn cakes, my favorite," said Carlos, and he spread honey on the hot pancake. "Where did you get the blue cornmeal?" "Why, Carlos, don't you remember?" asked Papa, holding back a smile. "You planted it yourself." And at that, Papa slapped both his knees and burst into laughter. Realizing then he had bought blue corn seeds instead of yellow, Carlos was embarrassed. "See, Papa," Carlos said sheepishly. Then he began to smile. "But I remember what you said. Cosechas lo que siembras. You reap what you sow." "That's right, Carlos," his father said. "By the way, I saw Senor Lopez the other day. He said to give this to you." And without another word, Papa reached across the table and handed Carlos his red pocket knife. The end. Adiós, clase.